Joining me now is the Democratic Congressman Tom Malinowski. He worked for President Obama to open up Myanmar and support democracy there. He was also former Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. And the Congressman is joining me from New Jersey. Welcome. So you heard what I was asking the journalists there, who were not naming for obvious reasons. But I did ask her, how she thought this was going to, end up. What do you think, in terms of is the military going to be successful in crushing democracy? And should the United States and other countries do something to make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, thank you, Christiane. I think it's not our job as leaders outside of Burma to predict what's going to happen. We don't know. Our job is to try to promote the best possible outcome. This is a long-running drama in Burma. We had a multi-decade struggle to end military rule, to establish democracy, which led to a partial transfer of power to civilians in the last decade. But we got to remember, the military never really gave up power. The military was still in charge of everything having to do with security in the country. And this is just a reminder that the job of building democracy in the country was unfinished. So I think the United States and democratic countries around the world, they've stood with the Burmese people for decades in this effort. They're going to continue and have to continue to stand with them.
So what was the fatal flaw then in this attempt to open the country up? The United States lifted sanctions because there was some perceived route to democracy. And yet, as you say, in that constitution, the military kept a lot of power. How was it ever going to be any different to what we see now? Were you worried back then in 2010 or whenever it was that this might happen again?
Oh, sure. I was worried in 2010. I was worried in 2015, 2016. There was a decision made by the United States and other Western countries to start treating Burma like a normal democracy, to lift all the remaining sanctions. And I thought then and still think that was a mistake. That said, the policy the policy that we all followed did succeed in moving Burma from absolute, total North Korea-style dictatorship to a country that was much more open. And I think one of the differences you're seeing now with this crackdown is that you have this whole generation of young people in Burma who have spent much of their lives kind of getting used to being pretty free, freedom of speech and freedom of movement, and they're more connected to the outside world and to each other. And so, they have no intention of going back and are showing great courage in expressing that.
And you heard the journalist. I mean, it could be a protracted. She said that there are reports that the military is hunkering down for at least 3 months in terms of ordering supplies and the like. And it didn't look like the protesters were going to be backing down. I spoke to the UN rapporteur, Tom Andrews, as this junta was creating its coup. And this is what he said to me.
I think it's clear that the military is afraid of what might happen on the streets. And that, again, is precisely the reason that it's so important for the international community to speak out and to act, because those who are champions of democracy and human rights within the country are either terrified or they're in detention.
So, Tom Malinowski, do you think that the international community has done enough? That was 2 weeks ago, and nothing seems to have changed. The military is, if anything, stepped up its presence, as you heard from the journalists, and we've heard talk of live fire and certainly rubber bullets. We know that. What's everybody waiting for?
Well, look, fighting a military coup is serious business. I don't need to tell you that. When soldiers decide to seize control of a country, that they're not going to just say, oh, gosh, whoops, never mind. We apologize because countries around the world issue a statement or at the first sign of public protest. So I think any serious observer of this would expect that this is going to be a protracted struggle. And a lot's going to depend on the balance of forces within the country. How sustained is the protest movement going to be? The most important part of this protest movement, I think, as an observer from the outside, is that a big chunk of the civil servants who make up the government of Burma, major institutions, banks, the healthcare system, they're staying home. There's a massive strike of civil servants in the country. They are trying to sanction the military themselves. And what they're asking us to do is to join in that effort by denying resources to the military, to its businesses, to the key leaders of this country. And so I think we've got a lot of tools that we can use here, which are, I fear, going to have to be used over a period of months to help tip the balance to the folks in Burma who are fighting to get their legitimate government back.
So, you said correctly that the military junta, which you described as North Korean style before this latest constitution, is not going to suddenly say, oops, I made a mistake, let's turn back. But they did say, I don't want U.S. sanctions and global sanctions. I mean, it was the pressure that you and the rest of the world put on them last time that did get them to move. And that was very significant. They don't want sanctions on them. This is what, your colleague, former U.S. ambassador to Myanmar, told me about how the U.S. would need to get into some kind of working arrangement with many of the other important countries to force some kind of change from this junta right now. Just take a listen.
We can't do this alone. We can and we must target the military and those who collude with this illegitimate new government that's being put in place against the will of the people. But we have to get our partners, our allies like Japan, like Korea, Australia, India is important, Singapore and ASEAN. Try to get these countries to recognize that this is very bad for the future of Myanmar, that it's already set back business interest, stability inside the country, that we all have a common interest.
So do you think that your allies in the region do believe that, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, etc., accept that they need to also step up to the plate? We're going to talk about China in a second, but your allies?
Yes, I think they do recognize it. And by the way, just a word on sanctions. I think we were successful 10, 15 years ago in putting pressure on the military to relax its grip. And that was a time when they were much more isolated than they are today. They're much more connected to the global economy, much more dependent on commerce today than they were in 2010, 2011. So keep that in mind. And yes, of course, although India, Singapore, they're not going to impose economic sanctions in the way that the United States can. It's important for the community of nations to be speaking in a single voice. ASEAN put out a statement on this that was pretty tough for ASEAN. Japan has been, I think, much more helpful, much more concerned than they have been in the past. Again, this is partly because we're not dealing with a military absolute dictatorship that has been there for 20 or 30 years. All these countries have gotten used to dealing with the new government, with Aung San Suu Kyi. She was their friend, and now she's in prison. So it's a little bit easier to build that coalition, I think, now.
So what about China? Again, you heard the journalists who we were talking to said that groups of protesters are going to embassies who they perceive to be supporting the junta. Well, one of those is China, and the Chinese foreign ministry has said, or the ambassador to Myanmar, we sincerely hope that the Myanmar people can distinguish right from wrong and guard against political manipulation so as to avoid undermining the friendship between the two peoples. Well, I mean, fine, that's a statement, but China doesn't look like it's doing anything to either even attempt to push back what's just happened. I mean, they're blocking any movement in the UN Security Council along with Russia. How serious is China's support, and without their help, can anything really be done to reverse this?
Actually, China allowed a statement in the Security Council a few days ago, which was pretty remarkable. Interestingly, Russia is the closest friend to the junta, more unequivocally a friend to the military than China is. I think China's caught between competing impulses. They don't exactly want to work with America and Europe to promote democracy in Burma for obvious reasons. At the same time, the Burmese military is not at all friendly to the Chinese historically, and they had a very good relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi, who's now sitting in prison. They've got a concern about stability on their border with Burma, about this thing getting out of control. So I don't expect China to be working in league with us on something like this, but I think it is interesting that they're in this middle position, and you know, they may be sending signals behind the scenes that are helpful, for all I know.
A quick reality check. This military junta says it's going to allow democratic elections. You know, the whole raison d'etre for this, in their view, was that this landslide that Aung San Suu Kyi had in the latest elections in November, they said it was, you know, rigged or fraudulent or whatever. Then they charged her with importing walkie-talkies, and then they said they would have elections. But some there are very concerned that they might just cut her party's, you know, off at the knees and not allow the NLD to take part. Do you think that's a realistic threat and a realistic scenario?
You know, it's in a way, it's a no-win situation for the military. It's maybe a strange thing to say because they're in charge right now. But if they allow any kind of opposition to run in the elections, the opposition will win overwhelmingly again, even more so, I think, after this. And if they don't, then it's a complete and total and utter sham that nobody in Burma, no one in the outside world is going to accept. And I do think, you know, Min Aung Hlaing, the head of the military, who's now attempting to run the country, I've met with him. I think he does, on some level, have a sense that he wants to be legitimate. He doesn't want to be a complete rogue. And I just don't see a way out for him unless they allow an election, either the restoration of this government, which is what they should do, or an election that is free and fair, but then he'll lose that election. Right? So they have dug up for themselves that it's going to be very hard to climb out of.
All right, Congressman Tom Malinowski, thank you very much for joining us.